everyone. It is 6 p.m. and it is August 17th, and I'm going to call the Anacortes City Council meeting to order. For the second week in a row, we are open for the public to join us, and after item 3 tonight will be open for public comment, and Mr. Kaufman, Matt Kaufman, will help the public speak at that time. Remember, the same decorum that goes on at a regular meeting goes on at an online meeting, and you're limited to 3 minutes. And welcome. We're thrilled that you're here. And council members, it's very good to see you also. So I'm going to call the meeting to order, and Ms. Hunt, would you take the roll?
Mr. Carter?
Here.
Mr. Young?
Here.
Mr. Walters?
Here.
Ms. Cleland McGrath?
Here.
Ms. Moulton?
Here.
Mr. McDougall?
Here.
Mr. Miller?
Here.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we're going to move on now to item 2, announcements and committee reports. And the first item is 2A, which is where I give my COVID-19 update. And today from the county, we presently have 934 positive cases in the county. We've had 86 people hospitalized. We've had 23 deaths, so 1 death more than last week. And we've had 629 people have recovered. Our county must have fewer than 25 people per 100,000 to advance to the next phase, and we're currently at 90.6 cases per 100,000 residents, so we have a ways to go. The county must have greater than 50 individuals tested per each new case during the prior week, and we currently have 1.2 cases per new case. Number 3, the percentage of individuals testing positive must be less than 2%, and we're currently at 80.2%. And the percentage of beds occupied in the county must be less than 80%. We do make this metric, we're at 67%. And lastly, percentage of beds occupied by COVID cases must be less than 10%, and we're currently at 2.8%. So actually that's good. We're meeting 2 metrics this week. So that's an uptick from a week ago. We were only meeting 1 out of the 5. Testing site at the college will be closed on September 7th to observe Labor Day, and will reopen on September 8th. The Washington State Department of Commerce is doing a recovery-oriented needs assessment, or a corona survey. The survey is voluntary and confidential. You'll be given an option to provide your name, your phone number, your email address, and each week the survey is running. 3 random participants will receive a gift card. And this will just help the state gather additional information as we navigate COVID-19. I'd like today to give a shout out to I got thinking about our essential businesses, and we've spent a lot of our energy focusing on the downtown core with parklets, but truly the folks that are on South Commercial from 12th to the roundabout have truly been our essential businesses and been on the front line since COVID began. We have our banks up there, we have our drugstores, we have restaurants, we have our auto repair, we have our hotels, our hospitals close to there. We have some of our online, Verizon, that type of business are there. Our salons are there. And those folks have really been in the trenches since day one. And I just want to think about their essential role in this economy. Because if you go down Commercial Avenue, South Commercial, they're always busy. So just acknowledging all the work that those business people have done for this community during COVID. And that really is all I have for today. I will be doing my additional community briefing on Wednesday. And I look forward to sharing more with the whole community. Any questions?
Mayor Garrett?
Yes.
Do we have any specifics on number of cases in the 98221 zip code or in Anacortes specifically?
We don't today. The hospital didn't give me an update on that. Oh, wait, excuse me. That is not true. Island Hospital. We've had 10 total positive cases since March. We have 0 deaths. And we tested 3,819 folks in 98221.
10 total positives.
10. So we as a community have done a very good job.
Yeah.
10 positive. 10 positive that have been hospitalized. 52 positive total. So 52
Okay.
10 have gone to the hospital, and no deaths in Anacortes.
All those cases found or were tested at Island Hospital. Do we know if Anacortes cases?
I don't know. The county at one point said they would break those out, but I have not seen those in a while. I think the workload over there has been pretty substantial. I know last week they were looking at hiring 3 new people to help them, so maybe that information will be coming forward soon. Also in the United States, we now have had 5,380,000 cases in the United States. So that concludes my COVID report. All right, so now we'll move on to item 2B, which is the Port City Liaison Meeting. And who would like to report on that?
Mayor Gear.
Lynn McGrath.
Hello. So we had our Port City Liaison meeting on August 11th, and Councilmember Young and Councilmember Carter were also in attendance along with Mayor Gear. So we did a nice kind of update. We talked about COVID-19 and how the city and the port are both handling kind of their respective areas. Parklets from the city's end should be coming sometime in the next couple weeks, next week, and then hopefully installed also, but I'm sure there's an update from Mr. Meismer on that one. But in the meantime, we've got stickers on the sidewalks. We have A-boards for quick pickup and drop-off for curbside delivery. We are encouraging temporary streeteries, which I think if you've gone downtown, you've seen and seem to be pretty successful until the parklets show up. And then we also kind of talked a little bit about how we are going to do working with Anacortes Family Center to do a rental assistance program. We've got about $57,000. And that the Anacortes Family Center will probably be the ones who will review applicants and distribute the funds, making sure that any kind of address is blacked out so that it is fair across the board. The port from their end have had their offices closed, and they've been working remotely as much as possible. They have been having a record-breaking number of boat launches this summer, which I think if you've seen the waterways, they've been packed. They have opened restrooms for the public, so they are working diligently about disinfecting and signage and those important procedures to maintain a safe environment. The marine terminal exports are down in that end because of the refineries slowing their processes. So they're thinking about looking for any kind of to diversify that customer base at some point. And then they also mentioned how that they are offering a 3-month rental deferment to lease tenants. They've got about 125 businesses, and there was a handful of businesses who elected to take that offer, but I think fewer than they had expected. So that's a good sign. EDOS gave us a quick rundown about the next round of granting that has occurred, which has been successful, and we've had about, I think, a half a dozen businesses receive funds in Anacortes, so that was great. Leadership Skagit for 2020 is the graduation is in September of this year. I believe Mr. Carter is graduating in this class. And there are still a few open spots if someone wants to participate for the 2021 class. And I believe it's $2,000 if you want to sponsor someone or partake. They're also working on an economic development recovery plan, and also kind of updating their Latinx retention and support of businesses. What other things? The port is still working on their main 4 improvements, which has helped our sales tax revenue. ADOT, Quiet Cove, Pier 1, or Curtis Wharf, and I think that's all 4, possibly. I might have missed one. But the important information is the fact that they had a record amount of pre-bid walkthroughs, so they've had a lot of businesses interested in doing the actual work and have gotten a lot of competitive pricing for that. So that's always great for our port. And then we finally wrapped up with the Northwest Basin redevelopment status. So as we mentioned in the last meeting, the planning committee and the port walked kind of the Northwest Basin area where that event center may be placed. And so we just kind of followed up with that with Don Meismer from the city and Brenda from the port. Just that I think it looks like we want to do some kind of a development agreement, but both entities have a shared goal of moving forward. So I think that's all I have, unless the other 2 members have anything to add.
Okay. Finance Committee. Who is there? No report?
Sorry, I can give Mayor Gary, I can give a quick report. The Finance Committee did meet last week, and my notes, we primarily discussed, actually Mr. Hoagland brought in some guest speakers that gave us a presentation on doing some refinancing of our utility bonds that we have in existence. So we're coming up on the time where the bonds can be refinanced, or the remaining balance of existing bonds for I think it was the water treatment plant and some other stuff are eligible for refinancing by the end of this year. And because of interest rates right now, due to the economy where it's at, it's actually really favorable to do that. So expect to see a presentation here in the next couple council meetings for the full council, where they'll bring in probably the same folks in similar presentation to give us kind of the full detail, and you know, we can look to discuss and perhaps decide if we want to pursue that course of action. So that was basically it for the finance meeting.
Thank you. And the Fiber Committee?
Mayor Gibb, I can cover that one as well. And actually, I'm going to pull up share screen. Nope, can't share screen because I'm not a host. Well, the Fiber Committee, as we do every couple weeks, the first thing we do is we jump into the numbers. So as of last Thursday, we had 274 customers in service. This is 223 residential and 51 business. So the installations have slowed a little bit, as basically all of the easy installations in our sort of our test zones have all been completed. So we're down to the harder installations that are like underground typically, or you know, some other barriers. So they have slowed a little bit, but we're almost also very nearly done with installations of existing customer signups in those zones. The take rate for our test zones or evaluation zones in the Central Business District, we were just under 39% of customers have signed up for service. And in Old Town, we're at 36.5%, and in M Avenue, just over 28%. So the 3 test zones we're above our goal of 35, and we're seeing additional signups every week. So those numbers, hopefully by the end of the year, we're well above 40 for those zones, and M Avenue is approaching 30 and 35 as well. Then in the aerial expansion areas, this is kind of most of the remaining aerial utility, or parts of the east end of town that are served by aerial utilities, and we're at 15.7% signups and 12% signups in kind of those areas, respectively. RBC is going to be expected to start doing some underground boring work here next week, and then follow up with aerial construction the first week of September for those expansion areas. And then our installation crews will be able to follow immediately behind the RBC folks. So they'll be able to start turning up customers in the expansion areas, hopefully essentially the second week in September or something like that, very, very near behind the RBC crew. And I think for now that's the main fiber update.
Yeah.
I think we'll see them back next week here anyway.
Okay, any additional comments? All right, then finally, our Public Works Committee.
Mayor Gear?
Alton.
Hi, thanks. So our Public Works Committee met today, just before this meeting, and Mr. Walters and Mr. Young were present. And we talked about a whole bunch of really cool stuff, as we usually do at Public Works. The first thing we talked about was actually the A Avenue dump site. The permitting process is currently underway with Ecology, so that's happening. The next thing we talked about was the wastewater treatment plant outfall, and the update is that in 3 to 4 weeks, council will see more contracts coming forward for the next phase of design. Everything's going well so far, and financing conversations are happening amongst staff and consultants. We next talked about the wastewater treatment plant Genefuel potential project, wherein our waste will be turned into a biofuel. So staff is getting the scope from the engineer to do a feasibility study, basically to see what the 10-year cost would be of keeping our incinerator going versus doing the Genefuel process. I forget exactly what that process is called right now, but turning waste into fuel. And so it's a 10-year cost study being done, and actually Ecology is going to help with the funding of that study because state agencies are very interested in this technology moving forward, and also exploring funding options for that project. Next, we talked about the water treatment plant Clearwell project, which is going well on schedule, and the raw water line is upcoming, and we'll hear more about that shortly. That's going well. As far as decommissioning the old water treatment plant, staff with other individuals and consultants is entering into the cleanup action plan phase of things. So how to do it exactly is coming up. We have a new operations manager, and that is Will Ludeman, and he was one of 9 applicants. He was formerly the fleet supervisor at Public Works at Operations, and he's been with the city, I believe, since about the year 2000. So we're excited to have him in place. Next, there was a climate change adaptation webinar that Mr. Buckenmeyer participated in. He was a presenter talking about climate change expectations in the next 70 years and how to prepare for those. So that's a webinar that we'll be able to see if we would like to. That's coming up also. We'll get recordings of that if we're interested. We then talked about the Skagit PUD South Fidalgo water system update, and that is not moving fast at all. We have 2 new commissioners that will be coming on board. One has already been appointed, and the next will be elected in November. So that's sort of on hold, but we would love to see that move forward. Next, we talked about face masks, and Mr. Buckenmeyer has been leading a concerted effort to ensure that masks are being worn by all staff at all times. So just keeping that message going and making sure we all do what we can to keep each other and ourselves safe. So I know we all have heard it before, but we still need to keep hearing it, so we keep doing it because it works. Then we talked about our Avenue, the long-term project that's been going on already for about 10 years, and the improvements there. There's a plan for a roundabout at 30th Street and R with widened sidewalks, and recently a request for quotes went out for consultants in the hopes that we can get quotes and be ready if there is more stimulus funding coming our way. So we want to get that moving along also. And that was pretty much it for today, unless Mr. Young or Mr. Walters wants to chime in.
No, you covered it completely. Thank you.
Thanks.
All right. So no additional reports from the council. All right, this time we'll move on to item 3, and this is where we're open for public comment. Mr. Kaufman, do we have some attendees that would like to speak?
Yes, we do. So let me go and patch on through, and
Okay. Well, welcome. Mr. Muntz, I see, is here.
Mayor, members of the City Council, thank you for the opportunity to comment. I wish to comment on the wetland portion of the proposed critical area ordinance. I believe there are very serious structural problems with that ordinance update. Everything's really simple. If someone comes in with a development application, then the city can make sure that standards are met, wetland delineations are done, mitigations are provided. But frankly, if there's no development application, if someone comes in with a backhoe, a riding lawnmower, or other equipment and just starts hacking at a wetland, there is no obvious way to protect that wetland under proposal. I want to go back, way back to 1989. We had a similar situation, West 8th in Kansas, where a property owner kept insisting that it wasn't a wetland, it wasn't a wetland. The city said it was. One day he went in with a backhoe and opened up the hillside and flooded 6 homes on West 6th Street. The then city council said, we are not going to chase people around and argue over these things. If there's an area that's mapped, it's over 10,000 square feet, it's a wetland area, we're going to protect it, period. We're not chasing people around and having arguments. We're going to protect it. But to the best of my knowledge, that ordinance is still on the books. It's not in the current draft of the ordinance. What it basically says is the burden is, we have enough information at the city to know where these large wetland areas are. The burden is on the property owner to show they're not wetlands, not on the city to somehow argue and make the case. So my pitch to you this evening is to look at that older ordinance. I believe it's still in effect, include it in the current draft, and make sure the city protects wetland areas and wetland buffers in the same way that you do stormwater. I was very impressed with the large scale ad in the American talking about concern about soapy water. Well, in my mind, wetlands and wetland buffers are just as significant, but if they're mapped and just suspected wetlands, there's a big enforcement issue. If they're designated, as I believe many major wetlands are in the city right now by city ordinance, it's a whole different category, and they actually get protected. So again, in conclusion, the current ordinance works fine if someone comes in with a development application. But if they don't, they just want to start moving stuff around and trashing wetlands, all you get is an argument and years of litigation. And so I urge you to take the older ordinance that's been in effect since 1990 and continue it in the current proposal. If there's an opportunity to take questions, I'd be happy to do that. But you can tell from my voice, I'm very passionate about this. It's something I worked on 30 years ago, and I hate to see us going backwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Muntz. Good to hear your voice. Okay, Mr. Kaufman, do we have someone else with us tonight?
yes, we do. We currently have a Mr. Tom Glade. I will patch him through right now.
Right. Welcome, Tom. Good to have you here tonight.
Mr. Glade, you're going to need to unmute yourself. There you go.
I just unmuted, so I'm calling to make some comments, a comment about last week's meeting, and Mr. Walters insisted that the ACFL and Anacortes Community Forest Lands be delisted as a critical areas. And I realize that formerly in the state regulations, community forest lands aren't listed as critical areas, and so therefore there's no statewide requirement or to protect such critical areas. But I think the Anacortes has one of the very few community forest lands, and I believe that the people of our community believe that it is definitely a critical area, and I would like the city see develop its own protections for that critical area. So I urge the city council to consider, including protections for the ACFL as a critical area. So thanks for the time.
All right, thank you, Mr. Glade. Okay, Matt, do we have someone else joining us?
There are currently no other people with their hands raised, Madam Mayor.
All right, so at this time, we'll move on then to item 4, which is our consent agenda. Items A and B, minutes and approval of claims.
Mayor Gear,
Miller,
I move to approve consent agenda items A and B.
Second.
I have a motion by Mr. Miller, a second by Mr. Young. Any comments? All in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, same sign. Motion carries. So at this time, we're going to move on to item 5 under other business. It's our critical area regulations. Mr. Meesmore is going to do an introduction, and then Ms. Sweatman will also speak to us this evening. Welcome, Mr. Meesmore.
Thank you, Mayor, members of the council and the audience. This evening is the second workshop with the City Council on the Planning Commission's recommendation for the second draft of the Critical Areas Ordinance. We'll be focusing tonight on wetlands and fish and wildlife habitat areas. Once the City Council has completed its review, and I think we probably will have maybe, at least one, maybe 2 more workshops. So once it's completed its review of the Planning Commission's recommendations, staff will develop a third draft incorporating the City Council's requested revisions. Once that draft is completed, we'll open up a formal written public comment period and as well a subsequent
Welcome to Zoom. Enter your meeting ID followed by enter your participant ID followed by pound. Other You have entered the meeting as a panelist. Attendees can now hear you speak.
Apologies for that. We are back online. So, sorry. Thank you.
All right, Ms. Swetnam.
Okay, thanks, Madam Mayor. Thanks, Matt. So there are two types of takings. One is a physical appropriation, and as I was saying, that's an eminent domain, and that's really not what's implicated by the Critical Areas Ordinance. The other type of taking is a regulatory taking, and that's a situation where an agency using its police power to regulate land use, regulation, zoning, those types of things, create something that either destroys a fundamental attribute of somebody's ownership, like it prevents them from being able to sell or something like that, or what I think comes up with the Critical Areas Ordinance, it denies all reasonable economic use. So I know the example that came up last week was the idea of buffers being expanded to the point where somebody couldn't develop a piece of property at all. And so what's in the proposed draft is really similar to what I think most communities or many communities have, which is a reasonable use exception. So it creates an opportunity for the agency to grant relief from the strict application of those code provisions or requirements in a situation where strict compliance would leave no reasonable use to the landowner. So it's not a situation where increased buffers mean somebody's got to decrease the footprint of their house. It's a situation where increased buffers would eliminate all reasonable economic use. And so as an agency, it's a good thing to have those provisions in there and a process that that somebody who thinks they're looking at a potential taking can go through to get that exception. So it's really a balance of the public interest in the regulations against that owner's economic interest. So, and I have talked with Mr. Meismer in the past about the language that's in the proposed draft, and it does provide that relief for owners who would be looking at an elimination of all reasonable economic use. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you all have about that.
Mayor Gear?
Miller.
I don't want to try to stump the attorney here, but the example that I'm thinking of is an accessory dwelling unit, because you could make an argument from our government side that, well, you don't need economic use to do an accessory dwelling unit, but certainly as a property owner, you might want to make an accessory dwelling unit, but perhaps you can't now because of we've expanded a wetlands buffer. Can you give me your legal opinion on that one?
Sure, that's a good example. And I think, on the surface, there's still the opportunity to have a primary residence there, but that analysis is exactly what the decision maker would be looking at in an application for relief under the reasonable use exception. So when somebody applies for that variance, they would make those arguments, and they would be looking at the criteria that's in the code. And then I believe those would go to our hearings examiner, if I'm not mistaken. And that hearing examiner would then, apply that criteria that's in the code to make that determination.
Okay.
Mayor Gear?
Mr. Walters.
Last week I did ask what we consider to be a reasonable use. Would that include or exclude an ADU, what size house, et cetera? And I got an answer to that question, but I don't recall where in the document that's specified. Does somebody on the line here that could answer that for us again?
Mayor, I think if we could bring Tess Cooper on board, that would be great. Tess, are you there?
I am. trying to get my camera to cooperate. Okay, so let's go to the section on reasonable use, variances, and I'll share my screen here in a moment.
Mayor Gear?
Yes, Mr. Miller.
Ms. Cooper, when you talk about a section, could you refer to the page number as well? Some of us Luddites use paper. That would be helpful, and we can't often read the stuff on the screen clearly. Appreciate it.
Mayor, that would be page 19.
Hey, thank you, Mr. Museum. Hey, Ms. Cooper.
Thank you. Great. Page 19. Let me see if I can get caught up here. Variance criteria. Reasonable use exceptions may be granted only if the applicant demonstrates that all of the requested action is consistent with the various proposals. One, special conditions and circumstances are exist that are peculiar to the land. The inability of the applicant to derive reasonable use of the property. Any modifications to the critical area will be evaluated through the report and mitigation. Mitigation sequencing has been applied. The proposal does not pose a threat. Applicant condition variance is correct. Bear with me here. Applicability. Intended as a last resort. So for the reasonable use variance, there isn't any specifications for that under this particular because the circumstances are so unknown. I think what Mr. Walters was specifically asking was about residential, ADUs. It's more applicable in specific for the single family residence exception, which is built into the permitted uses into the table on page 18. A new single family dwelling on an existing legal lot may intrude into a critical area or buffer when all of the following conditions are met. It's demonstrated that it's not feasible to avoid the buffer by buffer averaging. The development is the minimum necessary to achieve reasonable use of the lot determined by the by the decision maker. Found. Alteration of critical areas and their buffers, including all clearing, grading, and structures, has not or will not exceed cumulatively 2,800 square feet. And this action does not allow critical areas or their buffers to be converted to lawn or residential landscaping beyond a minimal area needed to maintain an improved structure. And mitigation sequencing has been applied. I think the key word in this title answers the question to whether an ADU and so forth is required. It's single-family residences and necessary appurtenances, and so that's the key word. So that is a driveway to access your home, a home, and then utilities. A garage is not considered necessary generally. Landscaping is not considered necessary generally. So it would just be the residential structure and an access driveway and utilities. So garages, accessory structures, and so forth are not necessary. They're just normal appurtenances instead of necessary appurtenances.
Here.
Mr. Walters?
I think we would benefit from some additional text in this section to clearly identify what is necessary appurtenance versus a normal appurtenance, either in a definition or just right here in the section. But maybe in this section by itself is not enough, because then you could still go to the reasonable use exception variance section and apply for it there. So maybe we need to make that clear in the reasonable use section. I know that some other jurisdictions, I think it's either Whatcom County or Bellingham, have identified a square footage that is reasonable. So, for example, if you have a lot that is entirely encumbered by a wetland and its buffer, and you cannot fit a house of X square feet on the property, then you for sure qualify for a reasonable use exception, assuming you meet the other criteria in it. If we rely just on the text, a reasonable use exception, then that leaves it open to interpretation by staff and arguments from the applicant, and it reduces the certainty that people are treated fairly, and that people can look at the code and know exactly what they are eligible to do. So I wonder if we might, maybe for the next meeting or the one after that, wherever here, research what Whatcom County does there, if I have that right, and see if there's a numeric value we could insert. I know that's not necessarily always desirable, but it would be a floor, because otherwise, and I've seen this in other jurisdictions that will remain nameless, but their initials are Skagit County, someone applies for a 4,000 square foot house, and they could achieve a 3,900 square foot house without intruding into the buffer, but they say, well, I've got to have a 4,000 square foot house. Who is staff to say, well, that's not reasonable, if we don't have some kind of numeric value to fall back on?
Mayor Gear?
Yes, Ms. Cooper.
We do currently have, so this is taken directly from Island County, which would be a more similar jurisdiction environmental-wise to Anacortes perhaps than Bellingham, Whatcom County. This is modeled directly from their critical area ordinance, and it does again have will not exceed cumulatively 2,800 square feet. So there is a number, maximum number in here. And that's cumulative. We can certainly say structure size. This is again all alteration. Where the justification of leaving it nebulous and up to the reviewer comes from different zoning, different neighborhood size. What is reasonable in one neighborhood amongst 5,000 to 6,000 square foot homes is not necessarily reasonable in another zoning designation in another section of town that only has 1,200 square foot homes. So it's really meant to be based on the environment, the zoning, the surrounding conditions, and so forth, to be able to do a blanket number. Doesn't actually takes the fairness out of it, because you're looking at what's fair for your neighborhood and what your neighbors have compared to just broadly what everybody else gets. That's generally the understanding for reasonable use reviews.
Mayor here.
Walters.
And I understand that point. I think I would not advocate to go in that policy direction, though. I think the size of the houses in the neighborhood is less relevant than the question of whether you are deprived economic use of your property in an absolute, more of an absolute sense. And the number that's in the table there allows you to degrade the critical area and its buffer up to 2,800 square feet. But again, if you can achieve a reasonable use So some square footage dwelling, without degrading the wetland or the wetlands buffer or the stream buffer by 2,800 square feet, you should be required to do that. So, you know, if there's a way to fit your house onto that lot without degrading the buffer, you should have to do that first, I think. And I think it will be very difficult for staff to require that unless they know with quite good certainty what qualifies as reasonable. And I also really think that the desire of our community is to have that certainty, to have a numeric value.
Where it says that mitigation sequencing has been applied, that is number 2 of mitigation sequencing, is must be the minimum necessary to achieve use. So it is implied in there. You have to demonstrate quantifiably what the minimum necessary to get what you can out of it. It is applied right in the mitigation sequencing that gets applied to that. So it is a factor in there, just to point that out.
Mayor Gear?
Mr. Miller.
I know we haven't really let Mr. Meismer or Ms. Cooper delve into this, but this is kind of the key. This is some of the key points of this regulation. And my question, I'm having a hard time finding where Ms. Cooper read or where it's written down about no garages, no landscape, no ADUs, because that's the kind of direct regulation that we ought to be as clear as possible about to make it as user friendly as it can possibly be, as opposed to the public, to the folks that you know, to the folks who are coming in and ask the questions of, you know, our wonderful planning department. Can I do this? They should already have a better idea of what that is, rather than waiting for the reasonable answer. So, did I not see that written down somewhere on some chapter and verse of no garage, no landscaping, and I just don't read it, or were you referring to a code somewhere else? That's probably for Ms. Cooper or Mr. Meisman.
Certainly, it's generally in definitions, and I'm checking our definitions now. Those are just general, broad definition, planning term definitions.
Okay, so my recommendation would be to make it very direct and not have that in definitions. Figure out how we can make that a permitted alteration or not permitted alteration, rather than be in some nebulous definition when we ultimately get to that point. But I'll try to wait till we get further into your presentation before we crush you with these kind of questions.
No, that's great. We actually won't go over this. This is all back in the last section.
Oh,
so
okay.
It's more important to actually discuss it, carry
Okay.
over from last week than to move on.
Yeah, because it goes to the big thing we talked about of takings versus, what can the folks that the property owners that are out there, what can they do? What are the impacts of this regulation? That's I want to try to make it as clear as possible.
Yeah, that's really good feedback.
Mayor Gear?
Yes, Mr. Meisner.
So I think in listening to this conversation, I think it would be appropriate, as Mr. Walters and Mr. Miller bring forward, to define exactly what necessary appurtenances means, and put it right here in the table. So we'll put something there for that. Thank you.
Right. Anything else on what we discussed last week? Okay, well, Ms. Cooper, would you like to start us on critical areas regulation draft 2 of wetlands and fish and wildlife habitat?
Yes, ma'am.
All right.
Okay. again, we're going to use the same color-coded layout to go over changes from Chapter 17 to Draft 2, changes that we're specifically here to talk about, which is the Planning Commission recommended changes to Draft 2, and any additional changes that were identified after that process. Chapter 1970, of course, has general provisions and critical area reviews, which we talked about last week. This week, we're going to do the next two sections, which is wetlands and fish and wildlife habitat conservation areas. Under the wetlands section, 1970-210, starting on page 36, these are the different sections under that chapter. Wetlands, description and purpose, and this is color-coded blue because it is new from Chapter 17, and it's just the consolidated information from the last code and has been reorganized and consolidated and put into a new section in this draft. Designation and rating is a carried over section. The new portion of that is that we've updated it to the 2014 manual. We have wetlands mapping and delineation. That is only new because it adds a reference to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers delineation manual. We have general development standards, which has stayed fairly the same. We have specific category development standards, which we will talk about in depth tonight about some changes. We have required buffer areas, which we will talk about in depth again tonight. Critical area report additional requirements. These are requirements that are additional specific to wetlands that weren't in the previous section under critical area procedures, which isn't changed from Chapter 17 at all. And we have some minor changes to the mitigation performance standards and requirements. We'll go over all of these. Again, under wetland designation and rating, the first change, which is not a big deal, it's just a periodic update change to reference the most recent Department of Ecology publication. And now it requires the updated rating form as well as the updated rating system manual and training from the Department of Ecology. And again, that's just a periodic update to reference the correct, most up-to-date information. The major issue that we have to talk about in this section is the removal of the fish and wildlife, or the removal of the regional significant wetlands and locally significant wetlands from the wetlands section. Staff originally removed these from the document because the way it was created in the last form of the critical area ordinance was confusing and not following best available science. As you can see, the underlined section, it designated regionally significant wetlands. The following wetlands are designated as Category 1, and it lists Canary Pond, Ships Harbor, Interpretive Preserve. But then it goes to say, except as to buffer widths shall be required for Category 2. So these wetlands are Category 1, but they have Category 2 buffers. Likewise with Category 2 wetlands, within the Little Cranberry, Whistle Lake, and Heart Lake watersheds. Locally significant wetlands were designated as Category 2 wetlands, except as to buffer width shall be required for Category 3. sorry. So what the discussion was and what the decision to do with the Planning Commission was, we had removed them outright, saying that, and Department of Ecology agreed with us, that the new rating system takes into consideration all of the important information and creates a more applicable, appropriate buffer to these significant wetlands, and that just outright naming a buffer category isn't going to be as protective. But the community responded very strongly that they felt these wetlands were important still, or significantly within our local area, and they wanted to keep them in some fashion to have more higher protective standards. The solution staff came up with was to move the designation of these wetlands out of the wetlands section, because, again, regionally significant wetlands and locally significant wetlands isn't a state standard, isn't a best available science-backed designation. There's no guidance from Department of Ecology. There's no nomination process. It made it really hard to implement and administrate. Whereas the Fish and Wildlife Habitat Conservation Area section has a best available science supported, a statewide recommendation supported nomination process for habitats of local importance. And these can be various habitats. They can be wetlands. We already have one wetland, the Capsante wetland, nominated as a habitat of local importance. So staff felt that this would be a more appropriate place to move these designations, and that beyond wetland protections, wetland buffer protections, they now fall under habitat protections as well, and would have an additional layer of biological evaluation, habitat management requirements.
Mayor Gear?
Mr. Walters?
So I'm fine with that solution there. I don't understand what the significance is of the underlining in this section.
It was just pointing out the confusion, why it's designated as a category 1, but yet the buffer is a category 2.
Okay, good. So I do want to point out, though, for all of us, that the insertion of that language about these wetlands like SHIP being designated as category 2 has reduced the protection available for that wetland. So I definitely think it's undesirable to call that out that way. And I'm fine with the staff suggestion here.
Mayor Gear?
Yeah.
Mr. Walters, would you elaborate a little bit on that statement you made?
Mayor Gear?
Yes, Mr. Walters.
Just that the Ship Harbor Interpretive Preserve wetland is a category 1 wetland, and our existing code says it's category 2. Says we should have buffer widths equal to category 2, even though in the introductory sentence says it should be category 1. Category 2 widths are smaller than category 1. I don't understand how we got to that place, but I'm glad that we are undoing it.
Mayor Gear?
Mayor Gear?
So I might be reading ahead, but it looks like the proposal is to make category 1 and 2 the same buffer width. So I think that point, while it's a valid point, if we approve the additional buffer, it won't matter.
Mayor Gear?
Mr. McDougall?
Is that indeed what we're doing? Are we making the category 2 buffer width requirement the same as a category 1 buffer width in this regulation?
No, this regulation isn't speaking about other wetland categories and buffer widths, just specifically to these wetlands. It's saying these are important wetlands. We are saying because they're important, we are going to outright label them as category 1 wetlands that are important to protect, but for some reason we're not going to assign them the buffer that matches that, they are gonna have a smaller buffer. So for only these specific wetlands, Cannery Pond, Ships Harbor Interpretive, and wetlands associated with Cranberry Lake, Whistle Lake, and Heart Lake.
Why would we do that?
Nobody knows. That's why staff proposes to remove it.
We are proposing to remove it. Okay, yes. Agreed. We should remove that.
Mayor Gear.
Yeah.
So, Ms. Cooper, I just want clarification. All of these wetlands that we're talking about, Cannery Pond, Ship Harbor, that are designated as Category 1, these have scientifically been reviewed and approved as Category 1, correct? Or have they been designated Category 1 because of their significance, their regional significance?
That's a very good question. They've only been designated because of their regional significance. There is no scientific evaluation behind that. And that's what the Department of Ecology is saying, is that that's not an appropriate way to protect these wetlands, is to just outright assign it. The more appropriate is to actually do the biological assessment to see specifically what these wetlands categories are so that they can be protected appropriately based on their current circumstances, their existing.
So then, because we have not done the thorough designation of the wetlands, of all of these specific wetlands, is the reason we just went to the most protective, which would be Category 1, and then stepped it back to Category 2, at least as of now, which I understand why it's being done, but I also think it really muddies the water when we are trying to make this document as clear as possible for the public.
Correct. That's exactly what we're doing, is we're removing this. This is not in this document. This is in the current Title 17, the existing, and it doesn't make sense, so it's being removed.
Good, thank you. I just wanted that to be as clear as possible.
Mayor Gear, I think that maybe the confusion just stems from the underlining, which would usually be used to indicate we're adding text. But
Very good.
Actually, it's just being highlighted.
Yeah. Okay. Additional comments, Ms. Moulton.
Okay, so now we have that clarified. I have just another clarification question related to the categories of these important wetlands that are regionally significant. So are we going to do this with best available science, or do we just say we're going to call them this category?
That's a very good question. What this is doing is now requiring anytime activity occurs within these surrounding wetlands, the wetland regulations will require that they're assessed based on best available science. And that above wetland protection, and when we get to the fish and wildlife habitat, we can talk more about it. So they will have wetland protections under the wetland regulations. They'll have to be evaluated based on best available science, and buffers will be applied appropriately. And then over and above that, they will have to have habitat value assessments done and habitat management plans for dealing with above just the wetland functions, but what these habitats are protecting for our valuable local important systems.
I think that sounds great. So if these will be judged on a case-by-case basis, so if I wanted to do, if I had a proposal to do any kind of a development in any of these areas, that's when the qualified professional would come in and determine what category these actually are and how they will be treated based on the intensity of the development that I'm proposing?
Exactly, and I have an example of that coming up.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, So as part of this, we have updated the maps, and that was a concern last week. All critical area maps as part of this process have been updated. We've added as much inventory as we have on file. We have both these PDF maps and an interactive GIS-based map that we can make available to the public, like the example that was sent out by Mr. Walters for Bellingham. That's live internally. Staff use it on a daily basis, but we can certainly add the wetland, streams, and habitats of local importance maps, interactive maps available to the public through the portal that way if you'd like to. One thing I want to note that...
Yeah, can I ask one question on that? Ms. Cooper, would there be a reason why we might not want to? I'm just curious, because I think it would be beneficial unless there's some reason why we may not want to as a city. So that's just my opinion.
The only reason I can think of that we would not do, which we still mask some of the data, like eagle trees and so forth, are still confidential. So those would still be available to staff, but we would mask those particular data to the public so they wouldn't be able to see the confidential information about specific species and locations. But as far as wetlands and streams, I don't foresee any issues with making that available.
Yeah, I agree with you. I just think that it would be a better way for the public to be just as aware as we are of those areas that are critical. And then it would also lead them to, the additional questions that they may have, whether they're projecting a project or not. But I just think the more public information we can provide them, the better we will all be for being as transparent as what we're doing. Thank you.
I think some of the issue comes up with, and this is part of where I was going with this discussion, is that our maps are as accurate as we can get them. A lot of this data is not our own data. We're taking it from National Wetland Inventory. We're taking it from previous surveys, windshield surveys that we've had consultants do for us to collect inventory. And then we add additional inventory every time a project comes in and we get an official delineation, we add that to the map. But the only issue is where folks think that these are highly accurate, showing exactly where the wetlands are, and not understanding that it is just a tool to help us look and start problem solving instead of using it exactly. And the main issue that's come up with why don't we have a full inventory? Why don't we have these maps? A comment earlier from the public that the city is only able to keep as much inventory as we have officially on file with mapping. We get into constitutional law, private property, illegal search and seizures. It's the same as building inspectors being able to go on private property to look at building issues and violations. Plain view doctrine, whatever we can see, we can put in our official inventory. Whatever information is given to us through the official permitting process, we can. But over and over again, the question comes up, why can't we have a comprehensive, full inventory map showing where every single wetland is? And it is an illegal search and seizure constitutional law issue with private property rights. We just can't do that as a city. We can collect as much accurate data as we can legally get.
So just to follow up a little bit, I'm sure it's a legal question that will be answered by Ms. Swetnam's department or someone, but it would seem that then it would be up to a disclaimer that maybe we can put on that sort of asserts these conditions and all of that. That would be helpful at some point. So thank you.
Mm-hmm. And there is the disclaimer at the bottom of the small PDF. If you can see, nobody can read it that small, but it would be in the I think most interactive maps click, these are the conditions of use. You must click, okay, I understand these before I use them. So generally those disclaimers are there. But I agree that that's the important key.
Mayor Gear?
Miller.
Yeah, I follow that discussion and the importance of kind of protecting property owners, but the challenge for us policymakers without a detailed map, without being able to ask questions like, how many private property parcels in the city of Anacortes back up to potential wetlands? Because we're trying to make policy that's going to impact people's use of their private property. That's a constitutionally protected kind of thing. So it's a pretty challenging balance, and I'm kind of for the more detailed map than the less detailed map. And again, I understand it's a challenge because, how did you delineate the green wetlands on the map, for example? And that's a real question.
Those would come through, if it's labeled as delineated, they came through an official wetland evaluation report for a project.
Because somebody came to the city and said, I want to do a project, you required them to do an evaluation, and that evaluation by that professional said, hey, these are wetlands. So again, the challenge really is these potential wetlands, and I think I interpreted what you said, that those were done by either drive-by surveys or best information you have. I'm talking about the pink, the magenta areas on the map.
Correct.
But I mean, that's the crutch of our whole discussion on policy is, what is the impact of what we're going to do with these regulations going to affect those, I'm guessing, hundreds of lots that are near potential wetlands? Okay, well, we don't really have an answer, but it's kind of important to figure out. And I understand the challenge from your department of trying to, you don't know, but the challenge, people doing work on their private property near a potential wetland, and then a neighbor calls it in, and then now they're responsible for messing with a potential wetland. So again, I'm very concerned about the map and would love it to be very detailed, especially since you're going to ask us to approve a policy that provides additional protection to land that we aren't quite sure exists.
Right, and that's the big key with the reasonable uses. We have to make sure that we have those allowances to make it fair to property owners as well.
Okay, thanks.
And work through those issues.
Yes.
Oh, thank you, Mayor. And a really good discussion, Mr. Miller. Several years ago, I want to say maybe 10 years ago, as Ms. Cooper mentioned, there was actually, well, it was called just a windshield survey. We had a consultant drive around and they found several areas that they felt were wetlands. We also used the mapping in our stormwater comprehensive plan to identify wetlands from years back as well. And so what normally happens is we have a customer that comes in, or a client, gets us on the phone. They're interested in a parcel. We let them know that there are potential wetlands on the site, and they need to go out and have what's called a reconnaissance level report done. And then that helps them understand what is really on site. We also have our development review group process. We encourage people to use that as much as possible. And that's where we can give them information on potential wetlands or stream or other issues such as geologically hazardous areas with the mapping that we have as well, to the best of our ability.
And for the issue of, I can understand making policy, but for those that aren't mapped and properties that we don't know that there's wetlands for, that's last week's discussion with adding under the critical area review processes, adding that basic worksheet questionnaire to every single permit. So for the folks that aren't aware of what wetlands are, wetland conditions are, and that they may potentially have an issue on their property, they'll have to work through that and answer questions, and that will trigger us in the department. Some of the questions they may answer we'll say, oh, there might be an issue here that we need to look at. So that's one extra method to catch those that may not be mapped, so that we can help prevent any mishaps.
Mayor
Mayor
Gear?
Gear?
Moulton, Mr. Miller.
Is there any kind of review or anything triggered by a potential real estate purchase that would indicate to the potential buyer that there might be wetlands? Is there any level of information or questionnaire? How would a potential buyer find something out before they even bought the property, that they might have a critical area on it or near it?
There's no way to regulatory require that, or through the, of course, there's disclosures. I can tell you that as a wetland consultant, that is the largest portion of your business, is realtors and property purchasers doing evaluations before purchase to see. And just like Mr. Muser said, the recon level evaluation, many realtors are savvy, and property owners, potential purchasers, go through that process. Not everybody is aware of it, and that's one thing that we can certainly do, and I'd like to do once this is finalized and adopted, is to do some brown bag lunch or outreach to the realtors' offices and do some education to the realtors so that they can bring better information to their clients.
I think that's a great idea. Thanks.
Mr. Miller.
Thank you, Mayor. My goal with this whole mapping thing is for the citizens not to have to go to your office for the first time ever and find out that, oh my goodness, I can't do what I thought I could do on my property. And again, that's a real challenge. And I'll give a kind of goofy example. You do a windshield drive-by and you see some cattails growing in somebody's, drainage ditch on their property, and you add that to the potential wetlands map, and now they're impacted by our regulations. And again, the first time they're going to know about it is when they come in to say, hey, I'd like to either expand my house or subdivide this lot or do some development there. That's my concern. Again, I realize it's challenging, but I just am uncomfortable with just being satisfied with the back end enforcement of this policy without, letting the public know as much as possible what we're doing up front.
Mayor Gear.
Yes.
I would like to kind of continue that with Ms. Moulton and Mr. Miller. I've less concern of those people that are considering purchasing property, because typically they have due diligence and there's a pending feasibility period when they have property under contract. My bigger concern are those property owners who have owned the property for a significant amount of time, have banked on the fact that based on the zoning that they fall under, that they could do something with their property in the future because they've been paying taxes on it for so many years. And now suddenly they feel like they know their property, and then they go to the city to start that process, and they are shocked about what has occurred in that time from purchasing, 2, 5, 10, 20, 30 years prior. I'm kind of curious because it's fuzzy in my head, so I'd like clarification. What happens to those? How are the setbacks affected if it's property adjacent to the ACFL? Are those having a significant setback implications under this new code? Can you speak to that?
Maybe when we get to that portion, it might be more appropriate.
Perfect. That's okay. I just want that to be kind of really clear, because there are a lot of adjacent property owners to the ACFL.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let's talk about that under the ACFL section.
Cool. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions on this one?
One thing I'd like to add before we move on is that the windshield surveys that we did have done 10 years ago, as well as the National Wetland Inventory, which actually used aerial photos and modeled that over hydric soils. though I say that my disclaimer is that this isn't highly accurate and we don't know how full our inventory is, I can say that our inventory is pretty robust for most of the city. There's, for major wetland systems, watersheds, again, using our stormwater data, we do have a lot of good information for the staff and for citizens to work with on this map.
Mayor Gear?
Miller.
So that's great news. Are you able to tell me exactly how many plots then with the city-owned plots are up against those surveyed wetlands?
We could certainly do a query. We could have
Yeah.
our GIS guru actually query parcels
so it could be done on GIS. Well, okay,
it can
great.
be done.
Yeah, I'd be very curious
To
what
touch
that.
the mapped wetlands.
Yeah, I'd be very curious what that number is and where they are. I think that'd be helpful at least to me. Thank you.
Mayor Gear?
Mr. Walters.
Well, and in GIS, we should also be able to extrude a buffer from the mapped border of the wetlands and capture any parcels that are touched by the buffer as well. I wonder if this should not be limited, not limited to wetlands and streams, but also geohazard areas.
We have maps for those as well. We have maps for all critical areas. And we could definitely derive data if we feel that's necessary. Okay, let's move on to save some time. The next change is a very minor change that was requested from the Department of Ecology under wetland category development standards. There was a disclaimer saying that limiting the small wetland exemption to category 4 wetlands only and replacing isolated wetlands with non-federally wetlands. So currently the regulations stated that all category 3 and category 4 wetlands were exempted if they were hydrologically isolated and under a size threshold, saying that they're so small, they're not connected to any other wetlands. Therefore, they're exempt from this requirement and you could develop them, you could impact them, you could do whatever. Category 3 and category 4. Best Available Science and Department of Ecology requested that we dropped the category 3 from that exemption and that it's only category 4s under 1,000 square feet, and they just asked us to change it to standard language, which is non-federally regulated wetlands instead of isolated. So it's just a really small change that was prompted by Department of Ecology that Planning Commission approved. Now we get into buffers. Buffers is going to be a pretty large discussion, as you can see. This is really for illustrative purposes. I'm not going to read every single one of these for time management. But you can see the amount of changes that have been implemented to improve the wetland buffer section and improve protections under wetland buffer section. The blue list is everything that was added from Title 17 into the proposed update. The red is additional changes, mostly stemming from Department of Ecology. We revised the buffer approach in this draft, and we'll talk about that here in a second, so that buffers are variable. So when we're talking about you can map a wetland and just apply a buffer and see. This approach, we have variable buffers. So based on site circumstances, based on the health of the wetlands, based on the intensity of the proposed project, all of those variables will spit out a different size buffer for different properties, same wetlands, and so forth. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. But that's the major change to this buffer section, is a new approach, which is commonly used in many jurisdictions. And so it makes us more comparable to the surrounding areas that are using that approach. And I'll talk just really quickly on the science of it so that you can feel a little more confident in making the decision to use that approach. Needed buffer widths vary widely based on science, depending on multiple primary factors. And I'm sorry, Ryan, it's underlined as well, just to highlight. I didn't create this slide, but it's just highlighting the important words so that you don't have to read the entire paragraph. To filter out coarse sediment from residential development next to a low quality wetland, a buffer needs to be a relatively flat area with dense grasses or forest shrub vegetation, and it needs a very small, minimal buffer size to do that work. From 20 to 30 feet is what science says is functional, a functional buffer to provide water quality. For a buffer that provides forage and nesting habitat for wetland-dependent species such as waterfowl, herons, amphibians in a high-quality wetland adjacent to residential development, it would require a buffer densely vegetated with trees and shrubs in the range of 200 to 300 feet. And you can see the little diagram, the water, the buffer zone, and the different inputs that affect what the buffer size is. So those primary factors from scientific literature says that...
Mayor here.
Mr. Walters.
So I had a question on that last slide before we keep going. The lowest quality wetland in our matrix is category 4, and it currently requires a 40-foot buffer. And we're proposing to go up to 50 foot for high intensity land use like a subdivision. So why is that if 20 to 30 feet is all that's required on this slide? Are there other functions that require greater distance?
There are, I believe that we proposed a smaller one, and all of those changes were required by Department of Ecology to increase our buffer sizes for our specific area and circumstances. So this is in general science, can be applied to certain areas and certain issues. I think potentially with our high precipitation and our stormwater issues in our urban area. So that's probably a rural. So think about, and this is broad nation, different environments, different climates, and so forth. So probably in a very rural, natural area, you could get away with 20 to 30 feet. But we're in an urban environment where we have high stormwater, high precipitation, and high inputs. And so so in our area, I believe, I remember that was a discussion with the Department of Ecology, as they felt it was more appropriate to have a little bit larger and not to meet these minimum buffers. So this isn't based on what City of Anacortes can get, can use scientifically. This is nationally.
So then this is sort of a more generic slide.
This is exactly a generic slide. You can see from Department of Ecology guidance for all of the state critical area ordinance updates. That's where this comes from.
And do I assume then correctly that they also provided some science when they said that we needed to increase the buffer width?
To us, they did not provide science, no. They did our review as a public entity and gave us their feedback based on their, and we can certainly challenge them. We don't have to take Department of Ecology's recommendations at all.
Yeah, I'm not particularly interested in challenging them, although I definitely understood that we could. Do we have a reasonable belief then, though, that their recommendations are based on science?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you look at our best available science, in urban environment with pavement and high intensity residential use, as well as much commercial and industrial use that we have, best available science absolutely backs up the fact that we need larger buffers. That a 20-foot buffer is not going to be sufficient in this environment. The three primary factors from the study is that wetland type and function, needing to protect buffer filter sediment, nutrients, toxics, providing screen, noise, light, providing forage, nesting, and resting habitat for wetland-dependent species. So number one is the wetland type and the function is the primary factor, number one. Primary factor number two is the type of adjacent land use and the expected impacts. And number three is the characteristics of the buffer. So is it sloped? What are the soils? What is the vegetation like? And so forth. What is the environmental conditions? So what is the type of wetland and its functions? What is the adjacent land use and the proposed impacts? And what is the characteristics of the existing condition of the buffer? So using those three primary influences is how we've derived our buffer system, our variable buffer system. You take the land use intensity of the proposed project, and it's project specific, not technically property or wetlands specific. And we had divided it into three, and you can see the proposed changes. These were, again, requested by Department of Ecology to make it more consistent with best available science. High land use intensity includes the following activities: commercial, industrial, institutional, retail sales, non-residential uses in zones where the primary intent is residential, high density, all residential zones, high intensity recreation such as golf courses and ball fields, and hobby farms. All of those activities, proposed development, fall under high land use intensity category. Moderate land use intensity is activities with moderate intensity, including open spaces, parks, trails, and logging roads. And then low land use intensity is forestry, cutting of trees only, which we don't have much of in this in our city limits. Open spaces such as passive recreation, natural resource preservation, and unpaved trails. So first you look at that table and pick what your activity is. And then you go to this table. After you have your wetland evaluation and assessment report done, and you find table one, whether you have habitat function score of 8 or 9 points, habitat function score of 6 or 7 points, or habitat function score of 3 to 5 points. And I'll show you in the next slide. Then you choose what wetland category it is.
Oh, thank you. Ms. Cooper, just a quick question. Thank you. I understand that this is a matrix with all these sort of moving parts. I wanted to ask a question about the land use intensity slide.
Okay.
Thanks. So I guess, so these definitions came from ecology? Is that where they came from, the new ones, the proposed ones?
Correct.
Okay, I guess I'm having trouble understanding how forestry is a low land use intensity versus some of the higher uses.
Good question. Forestry is technically considered harvesting. If a land is in forestry and it's a forestry activity, that land remains in forestry even if the trees are cut. The trees are replanted and they're growing. So it's a long time between that, but the land still remains in forestry where you're growing and harvesting, growing and harvesting, growing and harvesting trees. And forest practice permits and activities are required to implement best management practice when they're doing those activities to protect the critical areas. But they are allowed to, in Washington State, forestry activities are allowed to happen. There is no buffers. They're allowed to happen right up to the edge of the wetland because it's trees being removed and then those trees are being replaced in time. It's not converting the land to a more intense activity. So if we're logging and then converting the land, that doesn't fall into that category.
Okay, that's super interesting. Thank you for that clarification.
Certainly. And so let's go to the example that makes more sense. This rating sheet for Ship Harbor Wetland was done by the Department of Ecology for us in the process. They were courteous enough to go and do it for us. And you can see there's many more pages. You have to qualify and you have to be trained by Department of Ecology to do this. You fill out the worksheet, you total up the score on the front page, and your total score here, your total points, is what equals your wetland category. And then just in the habitat column alone, those are certain pages that ask about habitat quality and so forth, dependent species. The score from that column is your habitat score. So if we go back, so we have 22 points, which gives us a category 2 wetland. We have a habitat score of 8. Let's use this for sale piece of property right here, just as an example. Say we get development for continuing to subdivide this property. That would be high land use intensity, residential zone. We have a habitat score of 8. We have a category 2 wetland and a high intensity land use. So that gives us a 300-foot buffer. For this piece of property in this particular development. We want to compare that to the potential of putting a trail through. If we choose an unpaved trail, it would meet low land use intensity. And so that same activity would only have a 100-foot buffer because it's much less of an impact based on science to the area than what the residential would be. So if it's high, you would see 300, medium 225, or low for this particular wetland.
Mayor Gear.
Google.
Mr. Meismer or Ms. Cooper, would you happen to know, would the kind of trail that is like sort of a pervious material that allows water to seep through it, is that considered paved or unpaved?
That's considered paved. It's
okay.
Still paved, even though it's pervious.
Pervious. Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. It's a good question. So I'll pull this up just in case you wanted to look at, I think Ryan was saying, if you look, Ryan, we do have, and the rest of you, We do have buffers as low as 25 for category 4s. So we do match better that science of 20 to 30, and then the 200 to 300. We are pretty darn close with the lower extreme to the upper extreme of that range in these tables.
Mayor Gear?
Miller.
First of all, Ms. Cooper, that was a fantastic example of the Ship Harbor wetland and applying the low density, high density. That was awesome. I probably have the trouble with just accepting ecology's 200 to, I'm good with accepting 200 to 300 foot buffer, but as a blanket over all of Anacortes, where we have an equal amount of land really that's undeveloped and will remain undeveloped compared to, I don't really consider all of Anacortes city limits as urban as I think the application, the blanket application of ecology's version of the best available science of just applying, hey, Anacortes is an urban area, let's use 300 feet kind of thing. Are you understanding my comment?
And that's exactly what this matrix is, because you take into consideration what that wetland particular, does that wetland need? And if we were to go through, and I can bring that up if everybody wants to look at it, exactly what the questionnaire worksheet has, how many different pages and how many different, I think that's exactly, Mr. Miller, what the purpose of that wetland assessment is it asks those questions. How much pavement, how much stormwater issues, what are your water quality, what is your habitat, how much vegetation is around it?
Yeah, and like I said, that's a perfect example for the example that you use. My concern is broad brushing the 300 foot, for example, or increasing 100 feet and increasing moderate intensity activities in both category 1 and 2 blanket wide for the city. That's kind of my concern with that buffer.
But it's not blanket wide, because you're looking at each individual wetland specifically, and you're answering those specific questions to that one wetland. And so it will, if it doesn't need that, then it will fall in the 75-foot wetland.
Except that's the only wetland you know what category it is right now. We're trying to make policy on wetland categories that we don't know that are potential.
Oh, I've got examples. I've got multiple examples of current projects where the wetland is, the category is 40 foot. It's a category 4 wetland with a 40-foot buffer.
But for every one of those magenta areas on our map, and every one of those properties that are adjacent to those magenta areas on the map as well, and every property is adjacent to the Anacortes forest land as well.
I guess we just have to trust that the Department of Ecology did a thorough job putting the science to take into all of those factors.
My point is they didn't put it together for the entirety of Anacortes.
Gotcha.
Okay, thank you.
Mayor Gear?
Walter.
It seems to me that for most of our policy analysis purposes that we should just be looking at the first column in each of these tables, the high intensity column, because we're pretty much always talking about residential development. I mean, not always, obviously, but almost always. So while there's a lot of other numbers here on the screen, they are not very relevant if we wanted to simplify the policy analysis. We're pretty much always looking at the high intensity column. I think in the proposed definition of high intensity, we don't need the list of residential zones, because ecology's guidance is just residential greater than 1 unit per 5 acres. That's just all the residential, right? So we could probably simplify that and make it very, there used to be the zones in the previous draft, but I think we can just eliminate them rather than list them. I am wondering, well, I am not prepared to get into the scientific argument about anything, nor do I think that really we should. So these numbers generate lots of questions, but I'm going to assume until someone shows otherwise that these are just science-based, and that is how they are derived. But if you had a lower scoring wetland, you could go from the first table to the third table, and your buffer width could get lower based on that, but you're pretty much always going to be working out of that first column if you're a residential land use, which is generally what we're talking about. So I hope that is helpful as we evaluate some of these things. And maybe Ms. Cooper could bring us back some more examples in the future, just so that we could work through a couple of them.
If you feel it's valuable, I'd be happy to bring examples, or if you want to just contact me one-on-one and we can work through it outside of the public's time, we can certainly do that too. If you have more questions or really want to look more in depth at how it works, I'd be happy to walk you through it.
But I think it is very valuable for us to do it right here in full view of the public too. There's a chance some reporter might pick it up and raise awareness in the community of what it is we're doing and how it might impact them.
So I have a clarification from what Mr. Walters just said. Ms. Cooper, so I'm looking at the table on page 40, and it's saying moderate land use is R2, R3, and low land use intensity is R1. So I'm confused why we're only looking at that first column of high intensity. Or has that been changed?
I'm sorry, which page?
So I'm looking, I guess I need clarification from what Mr. Walters said about only looking at column 1 of high intensity use and those setbacks, because on page 40 of the draft, now are we changing it to all residential zone as high intensity?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. I missed that clarification, that's what we have confirmed.
Very good.
Okay.
One thought that came to me is that Department of Ecology did this system back in 2014. That's when they updated their whole system. And the majority of the state has been using it since then. We know that they may not be as timely as possible, but I think that they would have a good understanding and ideas of the quirks or the gaps in that system by now if the science wasn't supporting the system that the majority of the state is using. So that's 6 whole years that this system has been being used, just for a little bit of context. Okay. This isn't a change that we necessarily need to discuss. I just wanted to point it out that our old system was a very, very basic mitigation ratio requirements, and that we have adopted, again, the Department of Ecology guidance requirements that divides it out and really uses science and best management practices for the different types of mitigation. And you can see there's a much greater ratios and requirements, as much as 24:1. So the mitigation is greatly improved when mitigation is required. Again, the goal of the critical area ordinance is to avoid impacts and minimize them as possible so that mitigation isn't needed or is minimal. Wow. We went through that wetland section pretty fast. For the necessary requirements, discussions that need to be discussed for Planning Commission recommended changes, and an overview of how the wetland section has changed from current to proposed. Is there anything that you all had questions on that I maybe didn't go in depth on or didn't touch at all? I can go back to wetlands in general, description of purpose, designation and rating, mapping and delineation, general standards, the specific wetland categories, that's where we removed. And the required buffers, critical area report requirements, additional requirements, and then the mitigation ratios. I just wanted to show how it's been improved.
Here.
Mr. Walters.
To address a comment that we received earlier tonight, I think that it might be useful to look back at 1970-025, which we reviewed last week, and it's just some general statements about how the chapter functions. It includes a line that says critical areas and the required buffers may not be altered except as allowed by this chapter. So I think that we have text in this proposed code that would prevent the damage to a critical area outside of a development permit. But it might be useful there to address the commenter's concern, and also I think just the structure of the document to say that that line applies whether the critical area is mapped or designated or not, and that the city has to take action to enforce the chapter if it receives a complaint about something like that. And some language, and maybe it's elsewhere in here, but maybe it could be up front, just to say that where the planning director reasonably believes that a critical area has been damaged, but you haven't applied for a permit, so we don't already have a report, so we don't already have documentation that one exists, that we could require the property owner to get a report, or the city could go out and get a report. Something to address that possibility, so that we cover all the bases. We imagine a scenario where this occurs, where we clearly have authority to fix it, and maybe put that up front so that people know that you can't just go fill in a wetland just because you didn't apply for a building permit yet.
Thank you, Mr. Walters. That's something I made a note on as well, and that I did want to touch on, is that the definition, and that's where code comes from, is that you're always referring to what the defined term is. And sometimes it's helpful to actually have that in the text to make it clear there, and sometimes you do have to go to the defined terms to get justification. But development as a defined term means any human-made change, improvement, or unimprovement to real estate, including but not limited to buildings, structures, mining, dredging, filling, grading, paving, excavating, or drilling operations, and storage of equipment and materials. In the past, other jurisdictions that I'm familiar with actually include, which I made a note that I'd like to add, is that vegetation cutting removal beyond normal pruning and mowing is also generally included in that discussion. So that previous discussion, any vegetation alteration, any ground disturbing activity does fall under the defined term of development, and that's what we're talking about, would have required a permit even if they didn't get a permit, and that's where we fall under our unauthorized alterations and code violation sections to cover those activities that allow us to go back for after the fact permits and implement violations. So those activities are covered in the code.
Miller.
Mayor Greer, I think, and Tess, I think one of the things that we would like to look at is what Mr. Walters mentioned about known and potentially known wetlands and potential wetlands, and how we address those, and in giving city staff the authority to require owners of property where there are potential wetlands to deal with them as though the city knows that they are in fact wetlands. So I think having some stronger language there, as Mr. Walters mentioned, would be a good idea.
Thank you, Mr. Meisner.
Mayor Garrett.
Mr. Walters.
And although this usually comes up in the context of wetlands, it shouldn't be restricted to wetlands. It should be probably all four of the critical areas that we're trying to protect.
Agreed.
And that language is in the applicability, known and potential, and so forth. But we could certainly look for it, make sure it's there, make sure it's stronger, and add it to other sections to make it absolutely clear for sure. I'll do a little bit of looking and gathering some of that information so that we can move forward with that suggestion. It's a good one.
Yeah, specifically what I'd be looking for as a former prosecutor is a single line that says, "Thou shalt not fill the wetland," so that I can charge that one line without having to make reference all over the document.
Right. Regardless of whether there's a critical area shown on the map, the actual presence or absence of the features defined in this code as critical areas will govern. Yep, the city may require an applicant to submit technical information, and then protection. Yes, yep. So we can find out how to make it upfront and more easy to find.
And I think some stronger language does.
Yep, absolutely.
Thank you.
Let's do it.
Good conversation. Really good. Okay, where are we now, Tiff?
We are moving on to Fish and Wildlife Habitat Conservation Areas.
Okay, let's do it.
So there are just a few changes in here that we really need to discuss in depth tonight. The majority of the section is pretty similar to Chapter 17, except that there are some improvements, consolidations, again, with the description and purpose. We have made one change to the designations, which we talked about earlier, and I'll reiterate now. Mapping just says that we're going to update our maps. General development standards and specific standards for streams have been improved. Specific standards for other fish and wildlife habitat conservation areas, mainly Anacortes community forest lands and heron reefs. We need to talk about a little bit more in depth. Buffers, buffer widths and averaging for fish and wildlife habitat conservation areas hasn't changed. We add a notation for stormwater management facilities. The same critical area report additional requirements and mitigation performance standards. So I just want to refresh our memory what fish and wildlife habitat conservation areas are and with their descriptions, because it is kind of different than the other critical areas. They're lands managed for maintaining populations of species in suitable habitats within their natural geographic distribution, so that the habitat is sufficient to support viable populations over the long term. And we don't create isolated subpopulations. And the purpose of this chapter is to make sure that we have protection measures to preserve and enhance, especially anadromous fish species. The list of designations for fish and wildlife habitats are areas with federal, state, and Endangered Species Act species, commercial recreational shellfish areas, kelp and eelgrass beds, naturally occurring ponds under 20 acres, waters of the state, including streams, waters planted with game fish by government or tribal entities, areas with anadromous fish associations, state natural preserves designated by DNR, areas designated by the DNR as natural heritage program areas, state priority species and habitats, and lastly, habitats and species of local importance. These are all specific areas designated by us as a city for our own specific environment. And that's a discussion we had earlier. This is the section that we moved those wetlands of local importance into. Now they are listed at, under our specific habitats of local importance, along with the Anacortes Community Forest Lands, the March Point Heronry, and the 1.5 acre Park Reserve Capsante Wetland. We've now added Ships Harbor Wetland, Cannery Pond Wetland, and the Category 2 wetlands within the watersheds of Cranberry Lake, Whistle Lake, Heart Lake. And additionally, through the review process and public comment, Planning Commission has chosen to add Smiley's Bottom Wetlands to the list of nominated habitats and species of local importance. We have questions or discussions about maintaining this suggested change?
It's unanimous.
Very good. Here's the updated map, which you can see we are a pretty robust island with lots of important species and habitats. Here's the updated stream map as well. The main point here, which was an area of concern for the public, the map has retained all of the stream names that we've gone through in the past within our city and named the important stream. But what we've added in this update is the actual Washington Department of Natural Resources water typing system. So they've all now been broken out into type F streams, type N streams, and non-classified streams. So they're color-coded as such, and that's how they are called out in the code as well. But the map will retain the stream names, which is most important when you're actually looking at your property, looking at a region and wanting to understand more. So, go ahead.
I was going to say there are more stream types than that, and now here they are on the screen. But are there no differences in how we treat NS and NP streets?
So within City of Anacortes, the question is whether we actually have NP or NS streams or type F streams. The way this is primarily, yes, for the way we treat those streams themselves. In the past, this table was the stream names and said 50-foot buffers. So because we are in such an intense urban area, the buffer sizes, our best available science report that's in the packet, said that 50-foot buffers for all of these stream types is adequate and appropriate. So we've not changed the buffer size. The only reason we've broken them out is if you're doing an actual activity to the stream. If you're replacing a culvert, if you're dredging built up from a particular stretch that it is routed through a roadside ditch, and so forth. When you're doing activities in the streams, it's really important to be able to look at the function of that stream to decide what type of activities and best management practices need to be applied to that activity.
So is there any value of showing the two different kinds of non-fish streams on the map?
Yes, whether it's a perennial stream, whether it runs year-round, or whether it's a seasonal stream, absolutely affects your timing and the needs of that stream. Well, we don't have the data to be able to break it out. So the reason why it's just N is because we don't have our data broken out by the seasonal and perennial. We just have fish and non-fish streams at this point.
Okay.
We can update it as information comes in, or as we get, or we do additional assessments. Okay. This section for our, again, designated habitats of local importance, is where we incorporated the public's concern with eliminating all of the appendices that provided the rationale and reasoning behind designating the Anacortes Community Forest Lands as a habitat of local importance and its very own critical area to be regulated as such. And so that's where we took a little bit of the wording from the history and the appendices and summarized it into a brief paragraph to explain why it's designated, so people understand that forest lands, their lakes, watersheds, wetlands, bluffs, forests, knolls, hilltops, and so forth, are unique and irreplaceable habitats, and the city has specifically decided to preserve these lands and species through conservation easement programs. And we'll discuss the option next that was decided is, again, the city, this is development regulation, so we're talking about activities that are altering critical areas. So if we're altering the Anacortes Community Forest Lands, we want to talk about the science analysis, excuse me, the permitting requirements, and the mitigation requirements. But it's not appropriate to be talking about trail use, hiking, biking, fishing, and limiting management requirements and so forth. So instead of expanding this section to include a lot of the issues that the public had, that's where we recommended to create the new municipal code section under Title 12, public areas, to add the more specific management requirements for the Anacortes Community Forest Lands. So this was staff's solution to try to retain some of the important information about the Anacortes Community Forest Land. And the newly created was just added so people understand that it's not currently there. And once we do the draft, we'll remove that actual wording. And for formatting purposes, we just added the same purpose statement for the March Point Heronry as well.
Mayor Gear.
Mr. Walters.
So a couple of things on this slide. So number one, I want to reiterate that I think it makes sense to have ACFL regulations outside the Critical Areas Code, because the Critical Areas Code largely regulates private development. It should also apply to any development that occurs in the ACFL, but we can go beyond the standard regs for critical areas protections in its own chapter. And so Bob Berry had done a draft, and I have that, and Councilmember Moulton and I were going to meet later this week and talk a little bit more through it and see what we could come up with for having that section or that new chapter, which I think would be AMC 1218, cover the ACFL related stuff without having to have it all be injected into the Critical Areas Code, where it doesn't really fit, where it makes administration awkward, and where I think it actually makes it less likely that the real critical areas, the wetlands and the streams and the critical wildlife habitat, actually get the right levels of protection. I think that there are important techniques to the writing of these things to make them usable, readable, but also elegant. But I also have a question about the March Point heronry. It seems to me that the heronry is outside the city limits. Is that correct?
No, it is, the majority is located within city limits.
Does it run right up against the city limits?
Correct.
Okay. So Skagit Land Trust had submitted language for this, for protection of the heronry to the county for adoption as part of their annual code amendments. And I don't think that passed at the county, but I think it would have applied to the area inside the city's UGA. And if I have all of those pieces correct, it seems to me we should be asking the county to apply our critical areas code in the UGA. The UGA is supposed to be a transformative area where we are switching from rural uses to urban uses. And I think one of the main purposes is to accomplish that transformation of governance. But the county doesn't apply our critical areas code, they apply ours when they process permits. And while that's not necessarily something that, goes into this chapter, it is congruent right here. And we've never raised that issue before. And it seems to me that that's how it ought to be. We ought to get that fixed.
We worked hand in hand with Skagit County to make sure what we proposed in our, we were both updating it at the same time, and we communicated together, and we made sure that what they were updating was similar, if not the same, as what we proposed into ours.
Yes, but did the county adopt it?
Right.
I think they didn't. Do you happen to know for sure?
I don't know.
Okay. I'll verify.
But yes, whatever we adopt, they should have to apply in the UGA, correct? So we have not proposed any changes to the existing regulations for the ACFL that was already in our previous critical area regulations. We felt that they were adequate and appropriate. The only thing that we did was remove the appendices and add the purpose statement. Again, the rest of what staff proposes to do is exactly what Mr. Walters just described, is adding all of the more specified information for the Anacortes Community Forest Land into Title 12. And staff has started their own version of a draft of that as well. So between Bob Berry's, Mr. Walters, and staffs, we can certainly sit down and take a look and come up with a really good approach to doing that. There's a lot of good people at the table there to do that.
Okay.
And we did work closely with Skagit Land Trust to adopt their updated science studies recommendations, as well as correct a few. There was actually typo errors in the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife recommended habitat management section. And so we've previously, the Fish and Wildlife section under Great Blue Herons just said that you have to do a study and you have to provide us with that study, and you must meet the same requirements for what, excuse me, T. Bailey has already implemented. And that's the only wording that was in there. So there was no guidance for staff or the public on what they should do if they were developing in this area. So what staff did was just put those specific requirements in as buffers and distances so that you know exactly what the year-round urban buffer is, what the loud activities, extreme blasting buffer is, and so forth. And then for the March's Point colony, this is Great Blue Herons in general, but for the March's Point colony, because it is documented as a sensitive mega colony, that we have implemented, we propose to implement a year-round buffer of the most extreme case of 984 feet, which is, it was an odd multiplication factor of what they recommend. I think what Skagit County proposed was just an even 1,000 foot buffer, and I'm not sure why that didn't go through, but we're proposing 984 feet, which again is just a multiplication of what their recommendations are from the Department of Fish and Wildlife.
Mayor Gear?
Yes, Ms. Moulton.
Thank you. Ms. Cooper, do we have a definition anywhere of unusually loud activities? Not that we need it this second, but.
It would be in the Fish and Wildlife document, their management recommendations document. But we can certainly add that definition into our document if need be.
That might be helpful because so someone doesn't have to go look that up.
Yeah.
Somewhere else. Thanks.
Other comments on great blue herons?
Very good. We've got through all of the main important parts to discuss and clarifications. I know a lot of you looked through the document and had your own questions and comments. Is there anything else that we should discuss this evening?
Okay. Well, so the next time you see us, what are we going to review, Tim?
Next week, we will look over the last three sections, geologically hazardous areas, critical aquifer recharge areas, frequently flooded areas. These are really small sections. I don't think there's any major changes at all, so it should be very quick overview. We'll look at the definition section to see where there was some changes recommended there. And we can see, I'll take a look at what we've discussed and which definitions we've talked about are missing and should be added there. And then some other relevant code sections that the questions came up ahead of time where there are changes that need to be made as such, Title 19, where we talk about permit processes and the tables and so forth. So there's some other administrative changes that need to happen to other sections of code to make this implement correctly.
Okay. Any other questions, comments? Okay, well, great meeting. Thank you, Ms. Cooper. You did a wonderful job going deep. Mr. Walters, good questions. All of you, really good questions. I think we're going to end up with a really good document when we're done. Okay, at this time, I will adjourn the meeting. See you all soon. Good night.